My name is Jerome Fascione, and I've spent the last 3 decades learning and teaching about African American history. I was raised in a multicultural home where I was taught to seek the truth and work toward justice. You see, it is my belief that through education and the pursuit of truth, we can fix the injustices that exist in the world. I welcome you to Time Out for Black History. I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of Time Out for Black History. This will be episode 7, and we're going to look at a very difficult topic today. We're going to be looking at what slavery really was. I think sometimes we're so disconnected from history that we minimize events, and we don't really understand the true nature of the event. I once had somebody say to me, yeah, I get slavery was bad, but today some people work at Walmart and other places, and that's like slavery. No, it's not like slavery. I mean, I think really to say that is to not understand slavery. I have some people who say slave revolts were not justified because they were killing people and they were just being enslaved. Again, that statement only comes from somebody that doesn't understand the institution of slavery. So I'm going to break this up into probably 3 different episodes, part A, part B, and part C, because I'm trying to keep the episodes a little bit shorter so that you have time to watch them and then come back at another time. So we're going to generally look at 5 aspects of slavery. And again, this could be taught in a course that lasted a full year, but I'm giving you more of a synopsis, more of a general breakdown of the topic of what was slavery. So the 5 aspects we're going to be looking at are the physical aspect of slavery, the economic aspect of slavery, the social aspect of slavery, the educational aspect of slavery, and lastly, the political aspect. So what I mean when I say aspect is what role slavery played in those different arenas of American life, because those are 5 extremely important arenas in American life. And to be clear, and this goes all the way to 1865, but we're covering all the years before, also in this kind of discussion. By 1865, there were about 4.5 million blacks in America. 4 million of them were slaves. So the vast majority of black Americans, so that guy who says, well, there were free blacks. Yes, there were. But the vast majority of blacks living in America in 1865 were slaves. And with that term slave came all of the attributes associated with a slave. Okay, so let's first look at the physical side of what slavery was. Okay, so I'm going to put a picture up here of a slave family that's working on a cotton plantation. And so that was mom and dad. It was, and again, I'll talk in a minute about what that means, and the children aged from 3 and up who also worked in the cotton field. Okay, and that was physical toiling labor from sunup to sundown. There were different types in the low country. They had a task system of labor where people would go out and do individual tasks. But we're looking at right now kind of the Chesapeake, and we're looking at kind of the tobacco cotton plantations where you had the gang system of labor, which were large amounts of slaves all going out and doing this back-breaking work for an entire day. So when we talk about the physicalness of that labor day in and day out, was an extremely taxing job, and I use job in a very loose term because there was no physical compensation for that work. There were no protections. There were no nothing. It was sun up to sundown physical labor. Okay, there were some slaves also who did skilled labor, blacksmithing, things like that. But again, I'm giving you an overriding view of what that was like. Okay. The other physical component I want to talk about is the punishment portion of being a slave and what came with that in terms of the physical toll it took on your body. To not pick enough cotton resulted in whippings. I'm going to show you an image right now of the back. It's a very famous photograph. This is the back of a cotton plantation worker. And so you get this image, and that's not one experience with the whip. That's several experiences with the whip. And, you know, a lot of people talk about how and say, well, it didn't make sense for masters to damage their property. Well, it made plenty of sense because it was a deterrent to all the other slaves that worked on the plantation. And it sent a message about what would be accepted and not accepted. So if you had 40 slaves on your plantation, to whip one really bad sent a message to the 39 that that behavior would not be tolerated. So the argument that, oh, it wasn't really like that, well, it wasn't that kind of, you know, it wouldn't benefit the slave masters. That's just not factually true. There were some slave owners that used physical violence a lot more than others. But the physical toll that violence, and I'm not even talking about stuff like the torture tools that were used. I'm not even talking about the punishments of cutting off a foot in, you know, response to a slave attempting to run away. There were all kinds. You can look them up. My point here is to talk about the physical toll that slavery took. And again, we're talking about 1640 until 1865. Generation after generation after generation caught up in that physical toll that existed on the body of that individual. So when we talk about the current situation for Black Americans when it comes to health and things like that, this is all consistent. This goes back decades and decades and centuries on the physical toll that this took on the typical Black American that suffered through the system. Okay, so aside from physical, I also want to mention that I want everyone to remember this was supposedly a paternalistic institution. So the idea that those slave owners were looking out for the best interest of those slaves was the general mindset that was being put out there. It's not going to be until we get things like Uncle Tom's Cabin, we get Frederick Douglass, the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, that we start to see the truth and the realities of what slavery really was and what it consisted of for that average individual.